What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Many people ask me what it is that makes me put decks in certain orders on the tier list. It's usually a combination of whether the deck is good and how much you're going to see it. And I think a lot of the time what I focus on is decks that sort of define what your experience is going to be, decks that set the tone for the metagame. For this reason, it's basically impossible to start anywhere but with Hela. Hela is an absolute monster of a deck, an extremely powerful point output package with minimal investment in terms of having to think about things, very obvious snap points, and very large amounts of points on the board. Now, the only real flex slot in this deck is kind of just Giganto. There is another flex slot we're going to talk about, but that's less a flex slot. So let's start with Giganto versus Red Hulk. In previous iterations of Hela, it was much more important to have consistent point output, and you were not really able to get cards that sat in your hand out of your hand. In this case, Red Hulk ended up being worse than Giganto a lot of the time. However, Red Hulk has been performing a little bit better in this build because you are able to use Hellcow to get it out of your hand, meaning that instead of pitching it when it was 10 or 13 and worse than Giganto, you are now able to actually soak it all the way up and get full value out of having Red Hulk in the deck. I'm not saying this is make or break. Very easy to just replace this with Giganto. Don't go buying Red Hulk for this, but it is worth talking about how the dynamics in Hela have changed. The other flex spot that is reasonable to talk about is Luke Cage versus Wasp. Now, this is a case where, statistically, when you look at the numbers, every Luke Cage deck is performing better than every Wasp deck of comparable sample size. The issue you run into is a lot of people just don't understand what the point of the Wasp in the deck is, and while I will advocate for Luke Cage, I do think it's worth explaining why people are running Wasp. The main thing that Wasp lets you do is get free blink targets on turn 5. This can be a really valuable thing to leverage because your deck is so full of expensive stuff that literally any blink roll can be extremely beneficial to you. There are a lot of situations where getting that extra blink roll is the difference between getting to Hela and not getting to Hela. I personally prefer Luke Cage because I think of this deck as a pure stats deck, and when you're doing what this deck does, Luke Cage is a card that has about 311 in stats. You're very interested in playing 311s when the only thing that determines whether you win or not is the numbers on the board. For this reason, I think that this is the list of Hela that I'd be playing right now, but I think you'd be perfectly fine making swaps for either Giganto or Wasp if that is something you felt like you wanted to take advantage of. The reason this deck is first is because of its massive impact on the metagame. If you are not prepared to deal with something like this, you will get run over by it. And prepared to deal with it can take a lot of different forms. It can look like tech cards, it can look like bigger amounts of points. I've seen people playing Ghost, I've seen people playing things like US Agent, which is another point in favor of Luke Cage. And generally speaking, though, the major way people have decided to deal with it is by either A, going over the top of it, or B, clogging it up. And I think those are the things that set the parameters for this metagame, which is why Hela has to be talked about before any other deck. Moving on, no pun intended, to the move section of this video. I believe this list was sort of cooked up by Sizer. The basic ethos here is that you get points, and then you have these denial abilities with Cosmo and Eliath that can give you a lot of game into a lot of different things, but specifically into Hela. You can try to compete with Hela on points, but you can also just get ahead and try to make sure that where they play the Hela is a place that will not allow them to play the Hela. Having Cosmo moving around off of Madam Web is genuinely very powerful, and the combination of Cosmo and Eliath makes those final turns kind of a nightmare for a Hela player without priority. This is also just generally a collection of cards that work together to create large numbers of points. You are able to generate incredibly powerful board states and have these sort of 50-50 mix-ups on the final turn of the game, not just with where is Cosmo going to go to prevent my stuff from being interacted with, but can I even correctly guess the lane that the stuff I'm trying to Shang-Chi or Shadow King is going to be in? Are they going to Heimdall me? Are they going to Eliath me? What is actually happening? This deck weaponizes the unpredictability that it can bring to bear on turn 6. It's a lot of points, some meaningful interaction for the current metagame, And I really feel like I should say this again, it's a lot of points. This whole premise falls apart if you are drawing poorly and you have the wrong half of the deck. If you're drawing all your movers and no payoffs. If you're drawing all your payoffs and no movers, you're sitting there and you're twiddling your thumbs and you're trying to get ahead so you can be in a Lyeth Cosmo deck, but it doesn't matter because you can't actually put points on the board. This is a deck that snowballs. It wants to get ahead, it wants to stay ahead. One note about Cosmo Madam Web is because of the order in which move happens, it doesn't matter if you have priority for Cosmo Madam Web. That move will happen before any cards reveal anyway, so you will be able to use that in order to protect your stuff. The basic thing this deck is trying to do is play like any other mid-range deck that has relevant tech for the metagame. It's just doing so through a shell of move cards. Let's talk about Clog. We're going to start with the traditional list, which I find the least exciting and frankly, not necessarily the worst, but maybe the most predictable. This is a very straightforward list, and looking at the other two decks that you've seen here, you should understand why this strategy makes up the third pillar of this metagame. We have the stats mid-range deck, we have the combo deck that goes over the top, and we have a Clog deck that is looking to invalidate both of them by preventing them from doing anything they want to do at any point they want to do. One of the main through lines you're going to see across all the Clog decks that we're going to look at right now is the weaponization of Titania. The turn 4 Titania plus other Clog card is perhaps the most devastating combination in the game. A full Clog on turn 4 in any lane you have played 2 units in is a monstrously powerful play. The rest of this deck, it's kind of what you think it is. It's your usual tech and magic, and you know what this deck is doing. It is clogging you up, and then it is winning the game with some big guys or some cannonballs. Very straightforward, nothing to really write home about in terms of this. I personally am much more enthused by the hybridizations of this game plan into other decks, but if you want to play pure Clog, there is absolutely nothing stopping you. If you're looking for the easiest Clog deck to play, this is it. Hybrid Clog deck number 1, the Drink, is a deck that is hybridizing the move package into the Clog package. Now, the major thing that has really happened since the rise of Hela is decks like this, anyone doing a hybrid Clog package, have been forced to adopt a debris in the deck. And maybe that was the right thing to do all along, but it's definitely 100% the right thing to do now. If your opponent plays one card, you can go debris into Titania Green Goblin. That is a full Clog on turn 4. Again, you just set that up. It also minimizes the amount of total space on the board. Excellent against Hela. But that specific line, debris into Titania Clog, it's so devastating. It's so punishing. And hybridizing just the best parts of the Clog deck into a deck like this can yield a very powerful outcome of having this ability to clog your opponents up, having this ability to stop the points decks from doing point stuff to you, and also having the ability to leverage your own points package with Dagger and Vulture and your move stuff. It's a strong thing to be doing. Hybrid Clog number 2 should actually be familiar to those of you who have been following me long enough. This is just like a slightly updated version of a deck we played a while back. It is very similar to the Drink in that it is just hybridizing a different points package. The only thing that is different about this compared to the other deck is we're hybridizing a Ravona Thena package in here instead of the move package with Dagger and Vulture and Ghost Spider and Arana and all of that. We're just playing like a more straightforward traditional points package here, and it is just as successful. This is a deck that has reason to exist right now. When you look at the first 2 decks we talked about, this is the kind of deck that is built to beat them. It's built to be a deck that locks out your opponent and has a ton of power on the back end. A powerful, strong, straightforward deck that I think is fairly easy to play, fairly good right now, and just one of my favorite types of deck to play when I can get away with it. The best way to think about this deck, I think it makes it a little more clear, is this is a build-your-own Profex deck, the way we used to have to play Profex Cannonball Thena midrange. That's what this is trying to do now. Obviously, it is far worse than those lists because of all the cards in them that have gotten nerfed, not just Professor X, but like we used to be able to play like Mockingbird in there. We used to be able to play like Sasquatch and Iron Man. God, that was kind of a dream. Now we're very much more of a fair deck where the amount of impact we get out of what we're doing is no longer so outsized. We have to put effort into it. We have to make sure we're actually clogging them up. We have to deal with what they have on the board. But generally, I think this is a very strong list if you are looking to counter what other people are doing and have a strong backbone of this Thena game plan to begin with. Normally, decks like this are decks that are fairly straightforward and simple to play. This is what I like to call Affliction T-Shirt, a pure Affliction High Evolutionary deck that is one of the better decks to play at High Infinite at the moment, and is a very reasonable, powerful option into a lot of things that you just saw. The issues this deck has are that it is sort of limited in terms of flexibility. It's very much a deck that plays one card, and then one card, and then one card, and then one card, and then maybe two cards, but it is a bunch of really powerful cards. So upsides, this deck has a lot of explosive power, but downsides, it's not very flexible. It can be vulnerable to people that know what you're doing and are trying to stop it, but baseline power in this deck is very high. The more people start to gather what your final turns are, being things like, you played an Ajax on 5, your final turn is like a 2/11 US Agent and a 0/9 Abomination. Stuff like that is just like really, really strong. The baseline numbers in this deck, when things line up, are genuinely competitive with just about anything. Even weak Hela draws can fall victim to what this deck is doing, unless they have Loot Cage. And that's sort of the real, gate in front of this deck. It's able to take on a lot of stuff, but it does actually literally just lose to Loot Cage. Not even oh, haha, we kinda do. Just straight up 100% loses to Loot Cage. I also wanted to note that while this is the list I published in my video, and it currently has a 55% win rate on Untapped and top 10% Infinite with an 800 game sample size, I do think there's maybe some room to grow here. I'm not exactly sure what it is. I can tell you that I think Cyclops felt a little medium for me. I didn't feel like he was doing as much. I would honestly maybe consider running my own Luke Cage there instead. Definitely some things to think about with this archetype, but on the whole, it's an archetype worth respecting, an archetype you should understand when someone plays it against you, and an archetype that fundamentally just has an explosive amount of points, especially on turns 4 through 6. We talked about hybridizing the move package into a variety of other things. This is hybridizing the move package into the Storm War Machine Legion combo. The ethos here is that we take the move package, we do some strong points with it, and then we also have this random way to just absolutely beat Hela. Hela cannot beat Storm War Machine Legion. There are a lot of decks that cannot beat Storm War Machine Legion, if you can believe it. And so you also have this synergy, right? Your Storm and your War Machine, well, they actually synergize, right? They go together anyway if you just want to win that Storm lane. You also have your Madam Web. You can win that Storm lane backwards. There's some synergies here that make it not just a pure combo deck. Now, the other thing I want to highlight is that there are games where you're just turn 4 War Machine, turn 5 all my move crap, turn 6 literally play the Infinite. You can win games like that. You can actually just be okay, well, turn 4, I'm going to play a Madam Web on turn 2. On turn 4, I'm going to play a War Machine. On turn 5, I'm going to play Dagger, move the Dagger, bring it back to the Madam Web lane. And then turn 6, I just Madam Web the Dagger somewhere, play the Infinite, and it's just oh, that's just a whole bunch of power. And I think that that's a pretty fun thing to happen here too. There's just some interesting stuff that I think has largely gone underexplored. And I think this deck brings some interesting direction to an archetype that has sort of languished with people building for it in weird and potentially bad ways. I enjoy decks where it's let's put Section A together with Section B, the peanut butter and jelly deck building style. And this has some real overlap here, where these actually do go together in a meaningful way. Your Storm stuff synergizes with your move stuff. Arana, you can move stuff onto the Storm lane after it closes off. You can then also use turn 5 move stuff into the Infinite once you have a War Machine. There's some synergy here. There really is. Now, downsides, your deck is pretty fragile. When you draw weird, and I think you'll know what I mean if you play this deck, you can just kind of sit there doing nothing. Like, you can just actually not do enough points. That is a risk that you run when you play this list. I have absolutely no idea what the best list for Arishem is right now. I have been playing a surprising amount of this deck because I feel like it's like my own little, like, just mid deck that I can play a lot with, but I do pretty well when I play it. There's some pretty compelling evidence that statistically it's doing all right, and I think that there's something to be said for a deck that's really just trying to leverage, like, your opponent has no idea what you're doing. In a metagame like this, that can be really valuable because there's already a lot of question marks and things going on right now. And the other thing Arishem gets to be is a deck that gets to play Shang-Chi and Shadow King, and people just kind of always have to be afraid of it. You still have this pin of Shang-Chi, Shadow King, and Alioth, where it's like, okay, I lost priority, now I can Shang and Shadow King them. Oh, I gained priority, now I can Alioth them. It's a hard thing to play against, and I think that's what Arishem is really trying to leverage right now. But also sometimes, like, one of the things we've talked about throughout this video is, like, there are a bunch of decks that just, like, sometimes draw bad and just, like, fall apart. And Arishem being a little bit ahead every time means that it's just very able to be like, yo, you drew bad? Sorry, dude, I'm curving out. Sucks to be you. Now, you can all stop typing your I don't see Shadow King in that image because I had a second Arishem deck lined up to show you to illustrate just how much I don't know what the hell is going on in this archetype. There are like 8 cards that are in all of them, and then there's like 4 slots where you can do literally anything you want with them. Like, you could show me an Arishem deck with any card in it, probably, that made even the slightest amount of sense. Do not get in the comments and then be like, what about if I put Wolfsbane in here? That's not what I mean. But, like, there are probably like 25 cards that if you had them in those last 4 slots, I'd be like, sure, whatever, fine. It's probably fine. Like, you can probably get away with that. And that kind of thing is like, it adds to how confusing and hard it is to play against this deck, because it's just like, no one plays around Killmonger and Arishem, but it was in the other one, right? Like, it's just hard. You just don't know what the hell you're supposed to do when you run up against this deck. An Arishem deck snaps you, you don't know what it means anymore. It could mean anything. They could be playing any card. My preferred iteration of Bounce right now is the one that I've been championing for like the last week. I like Shadow King, I like Shang-Chi, I like the small Clog package. I like having all of this stuff available to me. And that does require some sacrifices in terms of power. Of the bounce decks you'll play, this one is by far the lowest in terms of actual numbers in the deck. You are not doing a ton of numbers. That is a real risk. But you do have a meaningfully large amount of interaction, and sometimes you are doing numbers, right? Like, sometimes you're doing, like, here's some 1/6s, here's a werewolf that's really big. But a lot of this is on the power of having not just interaction for their cards on the board, but interaction for their stuff, like preventing them from playing stuff on the board. With Viper and Hood and White Widow, you have the ability to like actually interact with and limit your opponent's plays. With Shang-Chi and Shadow King, you have some big numbers. It's a fairly metagamed deck. Like, I don't blame a bounce player for saying, actually, the direction I want to go is the exact opposite of this. I want to cut all the tech. I want to just do as many points as possible, and I want to try to go over the top of Hela. I haven't found that fruitful, but I don't blame you for having that reaction to this, because this is a very restrained bounce list. It's a very, it lives within itself, it lives within the context, and it lives within those cards that you put in here, your big swing Shang and stuff. That's got to be useful, and if it's not, you might be better off playing a different list. This list is basically the exact opposite in ethos, and it's why I wanted to highlight it, because these two lists are just diametrically opposed. They are not doing the same thing at all, but they are still both bounce decks. And I think that that is worth illustrating. Like, if we're going to talk about bounce decks, I can't put 5 lists on here, but what I can do is show you the two, like, the 2 poles here on either end of the spectrum, right? This list is saying, no, tech, I don't care. I'm not playing any tech. I am putting points on the board, and then sometimes I'm also living tribunaling. My goal here is a 128 power Human Torch distributed across 3 lanes. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get numbers, and I'm trying to spread them across 3 lanes. Sometimes I'm trying to get numbers, and then pick and choose 2 lanes if I don't feel like I want to be a tribunal deck that game. Maybe I just go dump a Human Torch somewhere else. Maybe I have a Human Torch in one lane and then a Dagger and a Vulture in another, and that's just enough for me to win, right? Like, this deck is the exact opposite. It's like, no, screw context. I don't care about context. Nothing matters except the numbers I put on the board. I am putting numbers on the board. Can you beat my numbers? Can you beat my numbers? Only question that matters. Wiccan lists have been sort of pushed downwards in the metagame by the presence of these decks that are willing to just go point for point with you forever. Like, you're not going to be able to go band for band with a Hela deck with a Wiccan deck. You're just not going to be able to do that. And so you have to hybridize by adding more points in here and trying to do something ridiculous. And this is the Woody Wakanya deck, which actually was in the original Arana video I made and has still continued to perform. I actually kind of think that if I were to play any Wiccan deck right now, it probably would be this one. You have to make such sacrifices to make a Wiccan deck that even has a ghost of a chance into a Hela deck or into one of those bounce decks that's just all about the points, where you're just like, I don't really understand how I'm supposed to be able to get to that level of points unless I do everything perfectly forever. It just doesn't seem like a matchup that's ever going to be favored for you. You are, of course, still good. It's just the context has changed around this deck. And it was changing before the Arana release, before the Madam Web release, before the Hellcow change that really defined this meta. But once those happened, the context changed dramatically very fast. The numbers this deck puts out are smaller than those combo decks, and you have to exist within those constraints now, where only a few weeks ago, Wiccan was the best deck in the game. A similar example would be the Wixie deck investing in more things that cost more, and this is a direct response to Hela, right? Like, this is very straightforwardly saying, I can't beat Hela unless I cheat harder, right? Like, their numbers are so much bigger than mine that I need to cheat even harder, which means you're just fundamentally a little more like Mr. Negative now, where it's just like, if you're not comboing off, your hand is just like 3 6s, which can happen. That's happened to me. You have these games where you're like, your opening hand is 3 6s, and you're just like, wow, I lose. It doesn't even matter what's happening in the game. I cannot win. And so, like, this is when I talk about the sort of existential crisis that Wiccan is having right now. This is what I mean. Like, it's a deck that is best when it is roughly similar in point output to the other decks that are doing this. And it just is not right now. It cannot compete with the decks that go over the top. Like Hela, the best you can do is like, I'll try and get priority and maybe 50-50 or 33% and Eliath them, depending on locations. It's hard. It's a tough situation to be in. And that's to say nothing of like the move decks or the clog decks, because you don't have any interaction for them either. You are just relying on numbers here. You're a numbers and interaction deck, but your interaction is Eliath and, like, you know, Mobius. And so if that's not good, you just kind of lose when they make a dagger that has 24 power. You can't beat that. Speaking of decks that were incredibly well-positioned and then became incredibly not well-positioned, Agatha is certainly one of those. Agatha's ethos as a top deck was even more points-oriented than Wiccan's was. At least Wiccan can try to be a deck that interacts with its opponent. Agatha does not interact in any way, and it turns out, if you play this deck into a Hela deck, the only way you're ever winning is if you discard their Hela. That's pretty much it. You discard their Hela, or they don't have it. And otherwise, their numbers are bigger than yours. And that's the only thing you have going for you. Your interaction is discarding stuff. That's it. Your points are big, but Hela's are bigger. And so when Hela raises the bar to here, in terms of how many points people need to have, then suddenly other decks rise up to that level. Decks have to build to be near there. We saw that with the Living Tribunal move deck. We saw that with the baseline move deck. You're building to be near there. You're building to have a higher point ceiling. That puts Agatha in a lot of trouble, because unless it is near the top of the point ceiling and its disruption can carry it over other decks that would otherwise beat it, it is not a deck that makes a lot of sense. Of all the decks that took hits from Hela rising up, I think this deck might have taken the biggest hit possible. It is very hard to justify this deck, to me, over playing Hela at almost any stage of the game. I'm never going to clown on anyone for playing Zoo. There is just so much to be said for consistent power output and a consistent ability to put numbers on the board. It's just that simple. This is a good deck. It will probably always be a good deck. I cannot think of a reason why it would not be a reasonable choice in a bunch of spots, but it is nonetheless a little bit hurt by the sort of chasing of the power ceiling that other decks are doing right now. It can be invalidated by Helas in certain situations. You end up with, a little bit less of a guarantee that you're going to win. One of the main draws of Zoo is it is just so often able to force your opponents to be in 50-50 situations where they have to read the Gilgamesh. And a lot of the time, Hela's bringing back multiple things that are competitive with those numbers. It's not bad. I don't want you to look at this and be like, KM thinks Zoo is bad. Zoo is just good, but it has been dinged a little bit by these changes to the metagame, especially being a deck that wants to fill itself up and is vulnerable to Clog and is vulnerable to Dagger. There are some issues this deck can have. This is a destroy list made by Shuri Enjoyer. He played it and other decks up to top 10. And I think this list is worth talking about because it represents the shift that we've been discussing many decks making. This list is playing both Aranya and Hulkbuster in an attempt to get even bigger Deadpools as a response to, we talked about the point ceiling of the metagame, rising upwards. So instead of being a deck that is, playing like an Arnim Zola trying to do that, we are fully invested in, I want to shortcut as many Deadpool turns as possible. I want him to be enormous. I want him to be gigantic. I would like to make as big of a Deadpool as I possibly can, because that is how I am able to reasonably go over the top of all of this crap that is running around right now. This is a pure destroy list. It is playing the kind of destroy that we played back in the day, where you're just trying to do turn 6, 7 energy, Deadpool null. Both of them are like 50 power, and that's it. That's the whole thing you're trying to do. Your job, set that up. If you set that up, you are probably winning. And so this is a deck that is reliant on drawing and snapping when you have your good hands. And a lot of the time, if you are able to manage things correctly, you will be rewarded for those snaps. It is an all-in destroy deck. Make no mistake about it. You're trying to do something that is very all-in, but there is a little less punish if you are able to do this and still throw priority. When people think of Phoenix Force, this is what they think of. And I think that is with good reason. This list hasn't really changed in forever. It's just been what it's been. And one of the things that I think, again, is really important to understand about this metagame is the way in which it's forced even a deck like Phoenix Force to change. What you'll notice about this deck, if you play it long enough, is that Shuri Nimrod doesn't beat Hela. Your points output just simply doesn't beat it. And it also can come up short in the face of decks that are looking to leverage Cosmo and Eliath in order to beat Hela. So you end up with a situation where Shuri Nimrod just isn't as reliable or as strong as it otherwise would be, forcing the deck to adapt. That adaptation has generally started to look like this. This list was brought to my attention by Jet and Husky Puppies. Jet, you may remember as the OG Phoenix Force guy. 40-page document on the intricacies of Phoenix Force before they got rid of all those intricacies when they made the move update happen. This is a list that is looking to play. It's called small ball here, relatively speaking. It's mostly referring to the energy cost, not the numbers here. But it's a very all-in Phoenix deck, where we're we want to get the Phoenix to happen. If we can't get the Phoenix to happen, maybe we'll make a big multiple man. Maybe we'll do something else here. Maybe we'll make a big Deadpool. But really what we're focused on is we need something stupid numbers-wise. We need to do a stupid thing with numbers. And if we don't do something sufficiently stupid with numbers, we're going to get run over by the decks that do. And so it's going all in on getting something broken, as opposed to building for a more consistent game plan like the Shuri Nimrod stuff, because the issue with the Shuri Nimrod stuff is even when you do that, you're still going to lose to Hela. So what's the point of it anyway? Just go all in and try to all in people and just win, 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 win. And I think that is a compelling ethos for me when it comes to how Phoenix Force is supposed to play out. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. I hope it was useful, not just as a collection of net decks, but as a demonstration of trends in the metagame and why they're happening. As always, I've been KMBest, you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.